Hello, my name is Olivier Delouis. I'm a permanent research fellow at the National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, in Paris. And I'm currently based in Oxford in a French research unit called the Maison Française d'Oxford. And during my stay, I'm also a visiting fellow in Byzantine Studies at Campion Hall. And as it is my duty again, I kindly ask you to mute your microphone and to write down your questions in the discussion and Q&A boxes. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Rosemary Morris, even if she needs no introduction, as she's been one of the leading historians in Byzantine monasticism for the last 30 years or so. And Rosemary taught medieval history at the University of Manchester until 2003, and more recently has held visiting professorships and fellowships at Queen's University Belfast, at the University of York, and at All Souls College in Oxford. She's the author of some well-known books that should be on the shelves of all Byzantinists, like Monks and Laymen in Byzantium, 1995, a classic, The Potiposis of the Monastery of the Theotokos Evangelitis with Robert Jordan, 2012. And she is, if I can say so, Rosemary, one of the best English-speaking reader of the French Archives de Latos series, archive that she has widely used in her works. She's also writing on Byzantine administrative and legal history. Robert Jordan sadly passed away in December 2021, although he was able to see this book completed. And Margaret Mullett has written about his life in a Fest Street volume that was published in 2004, and whose title, Metaphrastes or Gained in Translation, summarizes the important contribution of Robert Jordan in disseminating Byzantine sources to both learned and broader audiences. He was trained in ancient history and textual criticism. He taught classical Greek and Greek history in the 70s, and in the 80s, he turned to Byzantine text. We all know his significant contribution to the Byzantine Monastic Foundation documents volumes, published by Dumbarton Oaks in 2000. We know how essential he was to the Evergetis project, published in many volumes of the Belfast Byzantine Text and Translation series. And we will now enjoy the accuracy of his translation skills for those 9th century hagiographical texts. So the book I'm presenting today, The Life and Death of Theodore of Stoudios, is numbered 70 in the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library series. It contains 3 hagiographical texts about Theodore of Stoudios, born 759 and who died in 826. A prolific writer, as you know, in various genres, from theology to hagiography, from poetry to homiletics and epistolography. So 3 texts are given in this book, with new Greek editions for 2 of them, and this should be underlined. All translated into English. They are The Life of Theodore of Stoudios by Michael the Monk, called between specialists the Vita B, the encyclical letter of Nocratius, and the translation and burial of the remains of Theodore of Stoudios and Joseph of Thessaloniki, his brother, by the way, which is also included. So these are 3 crucial hagiographic documents in Saint Theodore's dossier, which is rich and had been given no less than 13 numbers in the Bibliotheca Hagiographica Graeca. So The Life of Theodore of Stoudios by Michael the Monk was written later than 848. It is a fascinating text for me, because not only because of the life of Theodore, which is taught, but also for the reinterpretation of this life and its promotion by Studite monks some decades after Theodore's death. The encyclical letter is a document which was composed immediately after Theodore's death in 826 by Nocratius, who succeeded Theodore in the position of abbot of Stoudios. So it is the first chronologically document of this dossier. And the translation of the remains of Theodore of Stoudios and Joseph of Thessaloniki was written for a ceremony which took place in January 844, and as you probably know, this ceremony would later be drawn or painted in the illuminated manuscript of the Menologion of Basil II. So let me say, to conclude this brief introduction, that the Bollandists in Brussels had indeed planned, in the beginning of the 20th century to edit all those texts. But Theodore, as you may know, is celebrated on the 11th of November. And so on the same day is Saint Martin of Tours, whose hagiographical dossier is much more significant and so big that it derailed the whole volume, where Martin should have been included in the Acta Sanctorum. So the Acta Sanctorum stopped in 1925 with a volume on the 10th of November. And this is why, as I was told once in Brussels, Saint Martin killed Saint Theodore. This is why we should be very thankful to Rosemary and to Robert Jordan, almost exactly 100 years after the Bollandists stopped working on Theodore, for partly filling the gap, providing new Greek texts and those excellent and richly annotated translations. So, Rosemary, the floor is yours, sorry.
Thank you very much indeed, Olivier. And it's, of course, I'm greatly privileged to have you by my side, as it were, as Olivier, I think, knows more about Theodore of Stoudios probably than anyone else on the planet. I'm now going to attempt to share my screen with you, but those who have listened to me give electronic lectures before will know that usually at this point, dark forces intervene and something appalling happens. So let's see how we go. So I hope that I have shared my screen. Yes, Olivier is nodding. And I will now hopefully get to the slide presentation. There we are. This is a minor miracle in itself, I must say. So thank you very much, Olivier, for your very kind invitation and introduction, and welcome everybody who's joined this session. As you can see, and as Olivier has pointed out, the volume is called The Life and Death of Theodore of Stoudios, and you see him here portrayed in the mosaic on the Neomone. Of course, he really doesn't need any introduction. He's celebrated as a very important igumenos of the monastery of Stoudios and founded in the 5th century, and is celebrated in the Orthodox Church for his defense of icon veneration, as well as monastic reforms. And something I learned from Olivier only this morning is that he is also celebrated in the Catholic Church, and that the late Pope Benedict himself devoted a very interesting homily to Theodore. So one learns, literally, one does learn something new every day. So I must say just a few words in tribute to my dear friend and colleague and collaborator on this volume, Robert Jordan. We worked in close collaboration, but he was responsible for the establishment and the translation into English of the Greek texts. And I was mainly responsible for the notes to the translation and to the general introduction. But I should also add, and I think he is actually electronically present with us, which is wonderful, that we had immense assistance from Professor Alexander Alexakis on collation of manuscripts and establishment of variant reading, especially in the second of our texts, the encyclical letter of Navkratios, where Professor Alexakis worked mightily, and this is all happening during the COVID period, to establish readings from a vast array of manuscripts, and some very tricky textual problems were sorted out by him. Of course, many of you will know of Bob's career as a translator of Byzantine texts, as Olivier has mentioned, in the Byzantine Monastic Foundation documents, and also his translation of a really challenging text, I think, the Synaxarion, the liturgical typicon of the monastery of Theotokos Evagatis. And we did have a very happy collaboration on our book containing the English translation, commentary, and a big discussion of the typicon of the Evagatis, a lot of the material of which actually derived from Bob's own doctoral thesis. So without him, there would not have been a translation of these texts, for sure, for me to talk about today. As Olivier has pointed out to you, there are 3 texts, and for reasons really of length, they're published in our volume in a slightly odd order. The longest of the texts is, of course, The Life by Michael the Monk, which comes first, after 868. Then follows this encyclical letter of Navkratios, and then the last text is the translation and burial of the remains of Theodore of Stoudios and his brother Joseph. The dates of these writings are not really, except for the encyclical letter, we can't really establish them very precisely, but the dating of the life, the Vita B so-called, and that of the translation and burial can be deduced really from mentions of abbots of Stoudios who are variously mentioned as Theos or Makarites, in other words, implying that they are no longer alive. So that's how that dating can be deduced. So there are 3 long lives of Theodore of Stoudios, and I really don't have time actually to talk about the very interesting issues in all of these texts. So what I thought I would do is simply turn to 1 or 2 issues from each of them which interested me, in order to try and whet your appetites to rush to your keyboards, order our book, read the texts, and use them as indeed they are intended to be used, as research aids and teaching aids and springboards for further study and comment. And that's really the mission of the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library. As the website says, to offer the classics of the medieval canon, as well as lesser known gems, and many of them are indeed gems, to a global audience through accessible modern translations. So to this first issue, how does the life of Theodore by Michael the Monk relate to other lives of the saint? Michael the Monk tells us that an extensive record in narrative form and in the style of panegyric already existed, but that Studite monks found this so difficult to follow that he had been asked by his brothers, as it were, to write a more accessible version. Now, it's been suggested by Dirk Krausmuller that this earlier life was written by the Patriarch Methodius. Well, be that as it may, all I would add here is that Michael writes in a pretty approachable Greek, insofar as I can see, but he himself was very highly educated, as his range of quotations indicates. He knew the fathers of the church very well. Obviously, there's lots of quotation from the Bible, but he also had a penchant for Josephus, and at one point quotes Aristotle, and another a Homeric tag. So was this, in fact, an account that was more accessible? And this raises very interesting questions, of course, about the educational level of his Studite audience. I wonder whether, in fact, he was sometimes indulging himself and maybe showing off just a little. We've also got 2 further long hagiographies, also written in the century after Theodore's death. The so-called Vita A, and it's only called that because it comes before the other one in PG. In some manuscripts attributed to the 10th century figure of Theodore Dastafates, and another longer life, the Vita C. Now, scholarly opinion seems to be agreed that Michael the monk's life was a model for both of them, but there is disagreement about which depends on the other. Is C dependent on A, or are we the other way around? So there's still an interesting problem, perhaps, to be solved here, and we probably can hope for help very soon on this issue, as a research student, Nolwenn Lecam in Paris, has written her doctoral dissertation on the Vita A. So we might have a lot more help on the nature of that particular text and its possible relationship with both C and indeed our text of Michael the monk. But suffice it to say that Michael's work was clearly an important stage in creating the official Stoudiite hagiographical record of Theodore's life. Now, Michael the monk himself has been recently the subject of much scholarship and could turn out to be quite an important author of the 9th century. And what might be called the maximalist view of his possible output attributes to him a number of encomia of saints and other hagiographies. And I refer you to the article by Dirk Krausmuller again. And more recently, a book which was in fact presented at the first Edinburgh online book festival. So you can find this presentation still on YouTube. By Oscar Prieto Dominguez, and this book unfortunately appeared too late to be included in the short bibliography which we're allowed in DOML, and of course would have done if it had come out a little earlier. However, I think there is still more work to be done to clarify who wrote the works which are variously attributed to Michael the monk, Michael the Archimandrite, and Michael the monk and Syncolos. And I was actually quite comforted by the fact that in his bibliography, Oscar Prieto Dominguez actually does attribute some of the works to Michael the Syncolos and some to Michael Monachos. So there is still a major series of questions really about, are we talking about one person, two people, or three people? Now, I myself ventured some thoughts on Michael the monk as a writer for the Society of Promotion of Byzantine Studies Autumn Lecture in 2021, which I hope will eventually appear on its website for anyone who is interested, particularly, as I was, in Michael the monk's familiarity with Josephus. However, be that as it may, we must move on. So Navkratios' encyclical letter. Well, the question that has really interested me, or a series of questions about this actually, is a very simple but profoundly important one, that Stoudiite writers were clearly not very sure where their hero Theodore died. Now, Navkratios, who was with him on his deathbed, doesn't make it clear where he is writing his letter from. Michael the monk, who made extensive use, actually, of this encyclical letter in his life, thought that Theodore had died at the monastery of St. Tryphon on Cape Akritas to the south of Chalcedon, and that his body was later taken to the island of Principe, one of the Prince's Islands off Constantinople, before it was reburied, as the account in our third text tells us, in the monastery of Stoudios. But the author of that translation and burial declares that Theodore died on Principe. So, to my mind, this is actually very surprising ignorance. But again, the whereabouts of the Stoudites from about 821 until 843, when they were allowed back into Constantinople, are themselves something of a mystery, as is Navkratios' precise status as Theodore's successor. He couldn't have been consecrated by the Patriarch, who was an iconoclast, and he does not seem to have been consecrated by the exiled iconodule Patriarch Nicephorus. So I think there's a lot in this text that we're not being told. And a second and completely unrelated question, which has been nagging at my mind for quite a long time, is why was this encyclical letter such a popular text in later centuries? Perhaps it could have stood as an exemplar of how to commemorate a revered figure. But why was it so popular, as you can see, after the 16th century? Some interesting questions which I really cannot answer, but I hope others may have some ideas about. Finally, just a few thoughts about the translation and burial. Now, this text has a very interesting structure. First, we have a short account of Theodore's life, then an account of how, 18 years after his death, Navkratios and Athanasius, who was hegumenos of the monastery of Secudion, which was linked to Stoudios in some way, and I really would not be prepared to use the phrase Studite Federation, because I think that might itself be a rather dangerous thing to do. But these two gentlemen gained permission from the Empress Theodora and the Patriarch Methodius to bring back Theodore's remains from Principe, and also those of his brother. So this section ends with Theodore's remains arriving by sea at Stoudios, and Olivier has mentioned the famous miniature that actually shows this. So interestingly enough, although this text tells us he came in a coffin, the miniature shows a little box. It's not the same. Obviously, there's a body in one, and there are, well, I don't know quite what, in the small box. So after this section, which ends with Theodore arriving at Stoudios, the next section is a short biography of Joseph, about whom our writer seems to have known or cared to relate remarkably little. Joseph died in exile in some remote spot in Thessaly, we're told. And it really is remarkable how many Orthodox websites have Joseph dying peacefully in Stoudios, which does not seem to have been the case. He, we're told, did not receive a proper burial, and his body was cast aside somewhere. Athanasius and Navkratios were hardly able to gather up his corpse, which had been reduced to a few bones and a little dust. Is this believable? Did Navkratios and Athanasius go somewhere in Thessaly themselves? Where did they go? What, in fact, or perhaps we should say who, was in the coffin brought with great ceremony to join that of his brother?
Rosemary, we may have time. We may leave a bit of time for questions.
Oh, right. I will stop. So this is an interesting question about this particular text. And I would just say that these three texts give us very important examples of how reputation of men in institutions was manipulated in Byzantium. And they are part, I think, of what we could call justifiably the Stoudiite propaganda machine. So I must stop there, of course, and I look forward to hearing your comments.